Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Freeborn podcast. My name's Clinton,
And I'm Ashley.
and we are starting a new series. And our whole podcast is based on freedom, right? And adventuring with God and where that plays. And this series, though, is going to be nailing down what is freedom? What does it mean in your life? What does it mean in the interacting with people around you? There's so many different types. And today's podcast is titled A Tale of Two Revolutions. You know, freedom doesn't always mean your way, right? And so we're going to nail that down today.
It's so well
Talk
put.
talk about history a little bit, and
Yeah, you got to learn from history.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the two revolutions we'll be talking about are the French Revolution and the American Revolution. There are just so many things you can learn from both of them because they were both motivated by this desire to be free.
Right.
But one failed miserably and one did not. And we can learn from that, right? So I'm excited to finally get to this topic because, like you said, the Freeborn is all about freedom. What we're going to talk about in this series is how to maintain that freedom, because just to be given this blanket, you are free now because of what Jesus did, doesn't mean you'll stay free. You actually, there are ways to lose freedom and there's ways to stay free. And we need to stay free. So we need to first understand what freedom is, and then how to maintain it, how it can be lost, how it can be increased, right? So we are the freeborn. We're born into freedom, which means that freedom is our birthright. And I said in our very first episode, Adventuring with God, that it's going to be very hard to follow God the way he designed you to unless you understand biblical freedom.
Right.
Because he's written your story in the context of Jesus Christ has made you free.
Right.
So,
it's the best version of you.
Absolutely. And in Galatians 5:1 says, for freedom, he's made us free. Not for servitude did he make us free. Not for salvation even did he make us free. It's not like, oh, yay, I'm saved and now I get to sit around and wait to go to heaven. It's for freedom. He made us free. So we are set free to do something. And he wrote our story in the context of freedom. And honestly, that's the only way we can live out that story.
Yeah.
So we have to understand it. And of course, it's freedom that the devil's going to fight against, because if he can get you outside of a free context, then you're less of a threat to him. So if God has given you freedom, then man can't take that away from you. Now, you can let them take it from you, or through deception, it can be taken from you, but it's actually illegal in the kingdom of God for man to strip you of your freedom. Even God doesn't take your freedom. He highly respects free will. It's kind of like the moral way the universe runs. So man definitely shouldn't do it. And what the Freeborn's trying to do is to just show you all of the illegal ways that have a mask of piety, of holiness and righteousness. But these are all devices that actually bind Christians and keep them from becoming everything God's created them to be. But on the opposite side of this, I understand why people choose that kind of control.
There's comfort in it. It's safety. It's consistent. Well, it can be consistent.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, it's just go back to a few episodes we were talking about the Israelites in the wilderness. They were like, man, at least we had consistent food in Egypt. And they were finding comfort in their slavery.
Right.
Mistreatment and other aspects of their lives they were willing to sacrifice due to consistency in other portions.
Yeah.
Right.
The safety and I think the safety and comfort of knowing what's next or knowing what's expected, it's just comfortable for us. Freedom, you're taking care of yourself in a lot of ways.
There's also
or you're making your own success.
Yeah, and it's also a lot of times these enslavements, we can call them, or confinements come with association, and everyone wants to feel a sense of belonging.
Well, it's a primal urge to want to belong.
It's easier to just go with the flow and fall into that safety and security and that sense of belonging that you get sometimes with giving up your freedom to be a part of certain organizations, part of certain communities, and so on.
Yeah. So I think while freedom feels great. It can be a little overwhelming and paralyzing at first. Like I think about when I first moved away to college, it was just 2 hours from my house. But I remember that feeling of exhilaration, like, oh my goodness, I'm on my own. I have my own place. I have my own money now. I have to take care of myself. My mom and dad aren't doing it, so I was kind of like excited about this new lease on life. But just a funny example of how freedom can become an overwhelming, paralyzing thing. I mean, going grocery shopping and looking at the cereal aisle and all the choices in the cereal aisle. I grew up, my mom didn't buy sugary cereal. Like when my brother and we would ever go and sleep overnight at a friend's house, literally one of my first questions was, what do you have for breakfast in the morning? Because I was looking for peanut butter Captain Crunch or something. Because that's nothing that would ever come into my home, but I wanted to eat it. I wanted to try it.
Right.
And so now I'm on my own. I have my own money and I'm grocery shopping for myself. My mom's not there telling me, no, don't do that.
Right.
So what do? I gained the freshman 15 because of all the cereal I was eating, all the cereal that I never had before. I just wanted to try it all. It didn't take long for me to realize, like, wow, this stuff makes me feel really bad. I'm gaining weight. This is actually really unhealthy. And so I started through my experience with doing whatever I wanted with the cereal, right? Getting as much as I wanted, eating however much I wanted, to restrain myself. Like, this makes me feel bad and I'm gaining weight. I don't like that. So I started to exert self-control. And then I began to realize, oh, my mom loved me. That's why she didn't buy me this stuff, because a steady diet of peanut butter Captain Crunch isn't good for me. And,
It's funny.
So that restraint that my mom was placing on me was her love. But that's the thing about freedom is I had to learn that restraint in order to bring myself back into a healthy lifestyle. And I think it's that initial step into freedom and how messy it is and how much trial and errors that's involved, that people that know better, like the church or our parents, they just, out of their love and concern, they don't want us to mess up. They don't want us to fall down.
Right.
And so they actually inadvertently stunt our growth and our ability to establish our own boundaries by not letting us do these things, by forcing us to obey these rules where eventually, if we want to be adults, if we want to be mature, we have to learn how to navigate, right? And so just in the Christian context, I think that's been stripped from us by the church with the legalistic approach. And so therefore, we don't know our boundaries. We don't know why we do what we do. And more importantly, we don't know God's voice. We don't know what he has to say for us because we're hearing everyone else.
Yeah, we're just following the pattern rather than understanding the pattern.
Understanding ourselves. And, so the thing we need to really understand is that God is not afraid of messes because he recognizes freedom by necessity is messy, right? Our house is a mess because we have children who are learning how to be adults. And
every year it gets better. I mean, seriously, honestly,
and
they clean up the basement enough and we sit and watch them do it after they destroyed it. They do that enough times. Every time we come down the basement, it's less messy the next time.
Yeah. But we have to be okay with the mess and coach them through it in order for them to reach this point of maturity where they're not even making those messes anymore. And see, that's what God is he's our coach. He's our mentor. He wants to walk this path with us. And I think what a legalistic approach does is make God our enemy, where he's angry at the mess and he's angry at the mistake. And there's no grace for when you fall, but you can't walk in freedom without stumbling a couple times.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
What I just hope to do with the Freeborn is foster like an atmosphere of grace and love that also frames the relationship with God as an adventure, where he's walking with you in a destiny that you need freedom in order to accomplish, at the same time training people to hear God's voice for themselves because he's their guide on this path of life.
Right.
And having a posture of like reconciliation and restoration when there's mistakes and people fall. If we did that, I just think we would have a completely different outcome, you know, and that's kind of what I want to see happen.
For sure.
And so that's what this whole series is about, is just helping us understand what freedom is, how to increase it, how to maintain it, and how it can be lost.
All right. So let's jump into a little bit about the two revolutions.
Yes. So the two revolutions, they're the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The American Revolution happened first, and then the French Revolution came hot on its heels. I think the American Revolution, the world saw that.
Right.
But what I want to do in talking about these two revolutions is actually introduce this character named William Wilberforce. So William Wilberforce was a politician in Britain, and he fought for 2 decades for the abolition of the British slave trade, and then ultimately the abolition of slavery throughout all the British colonies.
Right.
So this was like in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And I want to start with him because actually William Wilberforce is the reason why the idea of slavery is so abhorrent to us today.
Yeah.
And his cause of freeing the slaves is so impacted by both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. His cause was to free the slaves. But at the time that he started talking about it, slavery was standard practice in Britain and all of the world, actually.
Yeah, it was all over the world.
It was just the way things were. It was considered an economic necessity. It was even morally defensible to people. It was just how it is. And in fact, to say that the slave trade was evil before William Wilberforce, I mean, people didn't even say that.
Right. It was just a common thing.
And if they said it in whispers in their living room.
Right. Which is crazy to think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't say that publicly, because if you said that publicly, you would have been mocked and scoffed and outcast. So there was a time in the world where saying slavery is evil and bad was like,
yeah, you're crazy.
You're crazy.
Yeah.
Where they had to whisper that in their living rooms rather than not. So it was this unquestioned standard of living before William Wilberforce, and then after what he did, because of what he did, it was morally reprehensible and indefensible, and eventually eradicated from around the world. I mean, it's still around today, but slavery in its form back then.
Right, for sure.
The interesting thing is that William Wilberforce and his group of abolitionists, the first thing they went after was specifically the British slave trade. Just like that's gonna be our first step, but their ultimate goal was all the British colonies were gonna get rid of slavery everywhere. And honestly, as I was studying for this podcast, I realized in a way, like, that's what's going on with us right now. And when we're talking about legalism in church, like, our goal is for that to be completely eradicated from the church. But right now, we're just going after the specific form of legalism that we grew up with in the UPC, which was, this dress code for men and women, lifestyle expectations,
hierarchy.
Yeah. And right now, guys, like, if you've grown up in the UPC or something like it, you are in your living room whispering to your friends, I don't actually think it's wrong for women to cut their hair. Right. I don't actually think the Bible says that. I don't think I'll go to hell if I go to the movies.
And for every woman that maybe heard that just then and said, well, I don't think people are sitting there talking about it and having conversations about it. For every one of you that says that, there's probably 3 or 4 women that do.
Oh,
they sit there.
Women.
And there's a lot. We don't talk about it a lot. We get so many messages and so many different people contacting us.
Well,
it's kind of mind blowing. There's so many people out there that are on this path with us, and
but they're doing it in secret.
They're doing it in secret. That's the key. They're just sitting there, just sort of like, well, we're just going to keep going along with our way, and I don't really know what to do, so I'm just going to keep doing.
Yeah. So we're whispering to each other right now. But my goal, like our goal, is like, one day I want us to, before I'm dead, how about that? Before I'm dead, I want us to be able to look back at this time in the last 80 years of like the specific, UPC holiness standards and kind of laugh. Like, I can't believe we did that.
Right.
I can't believe we thought that was okay. I can't believe we thought that's what made us holy.
I mean, I'm already doing that about a lot of things. So
yeah, and not in a disrespectful way,
Not at
but
all.
guys, this is fundamentally opposed to the cross of Jesus Christ. Like I keep saying, it spits on the cross. And I want that to be such a mindset shift for all of us, that I want us to be so correctly oriented to the truth that we finally see these things correctly and say, I can't believe we thought that way. That was so backward. But right now, my point is we're whispering to each other in living rooms right now. One day it's going to be shouted from the rooftops, not just specific rules that are crazy, but legalism everywhere, because
Right.
it is everywhere. It's
Right.
in every denomination. It's in every religion. It doesn't belong in a relationship with God.
Right.
So 2 things that William Wilberforce did. The first thing he did was educate the population, educate the public. He wrote copiously about the evils of it. If you guys have ever seen Amazing Grace, the movie Amazing Grace, it's the story of this fight. Definitely recommend that you watch that. But he would bring like a slave ship that hundreds of slaves were transported across the ocean on into port in the British, like, I don't know, community or whatever.
At a British port. Yeah. It's
A British port.
It's a shipyard, probably.
Yeah, a shipyard. And let people see and smell
Yeah.
the ship and what human beings were being subjected to in order for them to have sugar in their tea, right? So then people started to stop putting sugar in their tea.
Right.
People did not agree with this inhumane treatment. They started to see the horrors of slavery and began to object to it. And so there was a huge populist movement against the slave trade because of the truth of what it was doing to human beings. At the same time, though, slavery was such an economic boon, and especially the government and people in charge, they saw it as, again, an economic
Right.
good. They didn't want to get rid of it. You know, they had personal reasons why it had to remain a thing.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure.
So he had to, so 2-pronged. While he was talking about it in Parliament and speaking against it, he was also educating the public. And the public eventually was on his side and joined him in the fight against slavery. But his real battle was in Parliament and trying to turn that tide around. At the same time, this is all happening in England, and they're growing a conscience over this issue. The French Revolution has begun, and it is happening over there in France. And the French Revolution, in a nutshell, simplified, basically, is that the French people started to really hate the oppression they were experiencing by the monarch, by the aristocrats, and the extravagant lives they were living on the backs of the French peasants, right? They didn't like living in poverty while the aristocrats and the monarch were living in total opulence
Right.
and extravagance up there.
Absolute opulence. I mean, if you ever look into it, the difference in which those peasants,
Yeah, stark.
yeah, I mean,
contrast.
it was disgusting. It was
Yeah.
filth. It was literally the worst of the worst conditions you can imagine. People dying of starvation when literally the French monarchy and the aristocrats were eating duck confit and chicken and turkey and steak in one meal.
Yeah,
And it was just massive elongated tables, 20, 40, 50 feet long tables full of food while the people outside starved.
well, you've heard of the Palace of Versailles, right? Where
Right.
Marie Antoinette and King Louis XIV, was it, lived? If that was built today, it would cost $2 billion.
Yeah.
I mean, they just milked the French people to build this. It had gold furniture. It had gold leaf everywhere. They would put on plays. They gambled nightly. They gambled fortunes away nightly. The cost of the required clothing in order to be in court, that itself was a fortune.
Right.
Just everything about it was opulence, and it was oppressive to the French people. And they were very right in wanting to be free from that.
Right.
So this rise to want to be free was very justified and even noble. but it quickly descended into something called the Reign of Terror. Have you heard of that? I mean, you know about the guillotine.
I know about the guillotine. I don't know about the title Reign of Terror, but
the guillotine, that was a part of the Reign of Terror. So there was this guy who was in charge named Maximilien Robespierre, and he was the one leading the massacre of the French monarch. Anyone who resisted their efforts to be free, he just sent them to the guillotine. The mob took control. And anyone who was sympathetic to the cause of the monarchs or the idea of monarchy, they were sent to the guillotine. To the point where if you showed pity for the victims, Robespierre said, pity is treason. So, I mean, that's tyranny in itself.
Right.
Like, you can't even show pity for someone who's being beheaded, you know? So what happened in the French Revolution? Well, it was just one tyranny replaced with another tyranny.
Right.
Basically. And what we saw was mob rule. And mob rule is basically when the majority dictates what happens and what doesn't. And when the mob becomes a law unto itself and says, we don't like that. And so we're going to make sure it doesn't happen. And if you're against us, we're going to get rid of you. And that's not freedom either.
Right.
So they went from being impoverished by the monarchy to being in terror by this maniac, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you guys have read the book, A Tale of Two Cities, but that's where I got the title of this episode, A Tale of Two Revolutions. The Tale of Two Cities is about the French Revolution, and I highly recommend it. I just want to focus on that whole idea of mob rule for a minute, because when you do, or when you become a law unto yourself, when you do what seems right to you, no matter what its impact is on others, you're not actually advancing the cause of freedom for everybody.
Right.
You're just further advancing another form of tyranny. There's just new leaders now and new victims, but it's the same old tyranny. And that's why I want to say at this point is that despite the title of this episode being Tale of Two Revolutions, in the church, I'm actually not calling for revolution at all, because when I hear the word revolution, I hear the word revolve. And I just think of this vicious cycle of I'm not, now we're on charge and now we're not in charge and now we're in charge. And so it's just a vicious repetition of a bad system.
Well, I hear when you see revolution, I think of revolt, and it's like the tearing down of those above. And I actually don't believe that's the case in some of these movements and a lot of these movements. Even the UPCI, we want revelation to happen. We don't need a revolution. We don't want to tear down leadership. We want their eyes to be opened. We want them to join us in this process. Right?
We want reformation. That's what Martin Luther wanted.
Right.
He wanted us to return to the original design.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we've gotten off track. Let's return to the original.
Yeah.
Let's reform what has gotten distorted and actually return to the wisdom of the maker in the original way this is supposed to be.
So no guillotines on the podcast.
No guillotines. That's right. So a revolution is just this drive to be at the top of the totem pole. It's actually not a drive for everyone to be free. It's just the drive not to be the slave anymore. And that's counterproductive to true freedom. True freedom wants everyone to be free and is willing to restrain itself so that other people's rights to live in peace and safety is not harmed. And that is not what was displayed by the French Revolution. It was just a new self-appointed tyrant forcing everyone through the threat of death to do what he wanted them to do.
Yeah.
And that kind of a vicious cycle actually will never end until I think wise and noble people rise up and say, we have to do things differently because this isn't working. So then I want to transition to the American Revolution right now and how it was conducted, because even though it happened before the French Revolution, you would think it happened after the French Revolution because of the way they conducted themselves. They were such geniuses. Honestly, the founders of our country were so well educated in past governments and in philosophy and in politics that they had this wisdom beyond themselves, I think, to actually establish a free nation and not just another tyranny. They show us that how we go about something is just as important, if not more important, than the thing we're going after itself. And because our founders were so well educated and so well read, they knew that a true blue democracy actually does not promise freedom for everyone involved, because in a democracy, the stronger in their majority will always dominate the weaker. In a true blue democracy, majority rule is just another form of mob rule. It's the tyranny of the majority. And they didn't want that. They didn't want, just because this group is bigger and stronger, they get to impose their will on the smaller and the weaker.
Right.
That's not true freedom for the weak. It's like people say, Ben Franklin said, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Like the lamb is clearly at a disadvantage in a democracy, right? So they knew that establishing just another democracy was going to perpetuate this vicious cycle of tyranny, and they wanted true freedom. So they knew they had to do something different. And we know, because we live in it, that they established a republic with a constitution and a bill of rights, and this document that we all as citizens agree to live according to in order to maintain our freedom, right? That's what they established. But going in, it was a huge experiment. But I want to talk about one of our founding fathers, actually two of them, but one of our founding fathers named Alexander Hamilton. He was a thought leader in the establishment of our nation, and his conduct in this is just so instructive. And I really want to use him as an example of what I would love for us as the Freeborn to display. We actually live in Hamilton.
Yeah, we live in Hamilton. Oh, I also thought of the play. Alexander Hamilton doesn't rap, for anyone that thinks he does. Yeah, so silly. Not a fan of the play. Anyway.
But Hamilton was actually born in a British colony in the Caribbean. So he was not born in Britain, or he was born in the Caribbean, and made his way, through, I think, providential ways to New York City, where he became a student at King's College, which is now Columbia University. And King's College was considered this bastion of British power. It was, New York City at the time was pro-king, pro-monarchy. It was this citadel of British authority in the American colonies. New York City, it was full of, they're called Tories, who wanted the American colonies to remain under British rule. And that's initially how Alexander Hamilton felt. The president of King's College at the time, Alexander Hamilton there, was Miles Cooper, who was unwaveringly loyal to the British crown, almost one of those fawning, like obnoxious lovers
all right, buddy,
of the
down.
king. Yeah. And he believed that New York City, the colonies, should remain under British authority. Well, Alexander Hamilton became one of his pupils, like one of his students. Well, as Alexander Hamilton continues to read and observe what's going on, his mind starts to change. And he's starting to see, like, oh, I don't know about this. I don't know if the American colonies should remain under British rule. I mean, look at the oppression. This doesn't seem right. So his mind is changing, and I'm sure he kept that under his breath because Miles Cooper was such a proponent of it. But as his mind was changing, and because he was a writer and just someone who thought so much, he began to write about this. And the more he wrote and the more he put that out there, the more he was getting a reputation for being a patriot, right? To the point where one day there was a massive gathering on this like grassy common area in King's College. Like college campuses have this everywhere, this grassy area where students gather. And people were making speeches about the injustice of the British crown and all the taxes that were being imposed.
And this is where Broadway was created. And Alexander Hamilton got up and rapped his writings. And now we have the play Alexander Hamilton. That was a great podcast, Ashley. No, just kidding. So students are gathering on this knoll.
Yeah. And tensions are high.
I can tell you that I would not fit in with that crowd. A bunch of highly intelligent, pretentious, slightly, I'm smarter than the next guy next to me mentalities, standing on a grassy knoll in New York, all getting up one after another, trying to one-up each other with their brains. I'd just be like, I have something to actually go do. I'll talk to you later. So anyway, go ahead.
Wow. Tell us how you really feel.
Just
Goodness.
teasing you nerds.
Nerds are just as important.
All right, you nerd, calm down. Just teasing.
If it wasn't for my nerd brain, you wouldn't be on this podcast.
There wouldn't be much to talk
There
about on
wouldn't
this
be a
podcast.
podcast.
Yeah. Well, there would be. It just probably
falling
would
off.
not be near as interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's become folklore, but during this gathering on the Commons, Alexander Hamilton's there, and someone's like poking him, saying, "Get up and say something." Obviously, they'd read his writing and things. Well, all of these, freedom thoughts have been running through Alexander's brain for so long that, he was ready to make a spontaneous speech, which he did. And it's folklore now, but they say he, as a 19-year-old, got up there and he just let it rip.
Let it go. That's awesome.
Let it rip. And by the time he was done, the place was silent. They were just jaws open, like, who is this kid? Oh my goodness. He was, at this point, the Boston Tea Party had happened. So he was like,
Tensions were high. Energy was high. Yeah.
And he was supporting the Boston Tea Party. He was like coming against all the taxes. He was just making his positions extremely public for the first time. And, just after a second of silence when he finished, there was just this uproar. And at that point, everyone knew who Alexander Hamilton was, including Miles Cooper, who was extremely offended that Alexander Hamilton would dare publicly side with the American colonies and speak so disrespectfully about the British crown, right? And so Miles Cooper's response was to become even more vocal about his hatred of the American Revolution, because here's Miles Cooper's side. He, as the president of King's College, had made it a great school, and his next goal was to turn it into a royal university it wasn't the US at the time, which would have been a huge accomplishment in his life. But this American Revolution was really getting in the way of his personal ambitions. It started out as this small thing that he didn't think was going to come to anything, that was just an irritant. But as more and more support came to this idea of freedom for the American colonies, and then as his own student, Alexander Hamilton stands up, very persuasively speaks about American freedom, now the revolution is a threat to his personal ambitions. And he just speaks so forcefully against it that he becomes one of the most hated people in New York City of the American patriots, right?
Right.
Well, one day, a flyer was posted around town that said Miles Cooper and 4 other Tories were responsible for the death of some American patriots during some altercation. And the flyer basically said that, Miles Cooper, you better flee, because we're coming for you. We're going to kill you. Well, he sticks around. He's not going anywhere. 2 weeks after this flyer, a mob has gathered, and one night they make their way to where Miles Cooper lives, which is actually in the same kind of living area as Alexander Hamilton. They're basically neighbors. Well, Hamilton hears about this mob that's coming to get Miles Cooper, and he knows he could be tarred and feathered. He could be hung tonight.
Right.
So Hamilton gets up, stands on the stairs going up to Cooper's apartment, and he tells the mob, like, stop, do not do this. Do not kill this man. He basically tries to convince the protesters, who were probably not in their right minds, that killing Miles Cooper, instead of promoting the cause of liberty, would, quote, disgrace and injure the glorious cause of liberty.
Right.
So Hamilton, in this moment, knows that murdering Cooper would not advance the cause. It would disgrace it. Now, if this was if this was in France during the French Revolution, what would have happened to Miles Cooper?
He would have been killed.
He would have been dragged in the street.
It would have been killed, and Hamilton would have been killed.
And Hamilton would have been killed. That's right. If Hamilton would have even been a figure, you know, because there was such terror to stand up against the mob, no one did it. So people were just murdered left and right for being against this cause of liberty.
Right.
And so somehow Alexander Hamilton knew that murdering this man was not a good decision. And, you know,
Right.
he grew up in the Caribbean. He saw slavery. He saw slave revolts. He saw slave revolts be squashed. He experienced that vicious cycle. And I think he just had this divine wisdom inside of him that said, for liberty to be established, there must be law and order. You know, there must be true justice. And so he stood up to the mob in that case and protected someone who actually disagreed with him, who was fighting against the cause of freedom that he was fighting for. And I just want us to notice that noble stance that he took for an enemy. Transitioning to one of our other founders named John Adams. John Adams was our second president, but at the time that we're picking him up, the Boston Massacre had just happened. So this was a face-off between British soldiers and a mob of American soldiers, or not
Right.
soldiers, but citizens, patriots. And through a miscommunication, one of the British soldiers thought they were told to fire on the Americans. They fired and killed, I think, 6 Americans. And obviously, the American patriots were enraged about this. It was actually Paul Revere who called this the Boston Massacre. And for him, this was the final straw. Right? Well, John Adams hears about this, what happened in Boston, and he's a lawyer at the time. And after much thought, he decides to defend the British soldiers. So John Adams believes in the cause of freedom in the American colonies.
Right.
He's putting a lot of writing out there. You know, he supports this idea of freedom and freedom of religion and freedom in all cases. But as a lawyer, he chooses to defend the British. Why would he do that? That's just incredible.
Right.
Obviously, he was publicly humiliated for taking this position. Why would you defend the British? They're our enemies. Why would you defend them in court? And ultimately, these British soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter, but they were not executed for it. They just had the letter M branded into their thumbs, but he kept them from being executed. And what he said, why he did this, I mean, people were very angry at him for this, but he said he did it for liberty.
For sure.
He defended the British for liberty. He wanted to show England that this new America was not a land of anarchy, but a place where there is fair trial, where there is a jury of your peers that are going to fairly judge
Right.
your actions. Whereas, again, in the French Revolution, the murders happened. There was no fair trial. There was no jury of your peers. There was no legal precedent.
Well, even in the British leadership, and I don't know what to call it, monarchy, if the reverse had happened, the king gets the final say. You know, if the king would overrule anyone really, and if he would have wanted to put him to death, and John Adams taking this position said, we're not going to stoop to that level.
Yeah.
We're going to be better.
We're going to be better. We're going to do that. And he believed in their dignity as human beings and their right to a fair trial, that he was willing. He basically sacrificed himself in terms of like public acceptance and his good reputation now we look back and we're like, that was so noble, but at the time it was not easy.
No. Can't imagine the criticism he went under.
Yeah.
You know.
Bill O'Reilly, I read this in Bill O'Reilly's book, and he wrote, the victory brings disdain for John Adams. So the victory of Adams defending the British soldiers and them, yes, they were charged, but they were just branded rather than killed. The victory brings disdain, but John Adams does not care. His firm belief in American independence is slowly starting to build. Adams' win in court sends a clear message to England that America is not a land of anarchy, but a place where justice prevails. Adams believes representing the British soldiers at their trial is the greatest service I have ever rendered to my country. That's incredible.
That's good.
If we go back to Alexander Hamilton, Ron Chernow writes in Hamilton's biography, this episode of Hamilton protecting Miles Cooper, it captures the contradictory impulses inside this complex young man. One, a committed revolutionary who had a profound dread that popular sentiment would boil over into dangerous excess. Even amid an insurrection that he supported, he fretted about the damage to authority and worried about mob rule. The American Revolution was to succeed because it was undertaken by skeptical men who knew that the same passions that toppled tyrannies could be applied to destructive ends. Hamilton saw too clearly that greater freedom could lead to greater disorder and dangerously back to a loss of freedom. And so because of their belief in freedom, they established a nation that maintains its freedom by creating a tension within itself. That's what the checks and balances is all about.
Right.
That's so the electoral system and the houses of representatives and the Senate, like all of this checks and balances is to keep mob rule from happening and for us to descend into just another tyranny. Do you know what I mean?
For sure.
And so that's kind of the groundwork that I want us to go into this series with, is that actually a life of freedom and the walk of freedom is one of tension. Where the impulse to be free is checked by the impulse, honestly, to love others.
Right.
And I want us to see how freedom is a call to greatness.
Absolutely.
And
That's
the
good.
highest form of freedom actually is self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Or maybe the highest display of freedom is self-sacrifice.
Yeah, the decision to self-sacrifice, yeah.
We saw that with Hamilton for Miles Cooper. We saw that with John Adams for the British soldiers, but we first saw that in Jesus, who died for us so we could be free. So freedom is a noble, high call. And God giving us this gift of freedom is the greatest compliment ever, because it calls us to greatness. Whereas legalism talks down to us and says, you're guilty before you're innocent. There's worthlessness in you and you can't ever get it right, so we're going to do it for you.
Right.
Freedom is like a high call from God that says, I believe in what's in you because I put it there, and I'm going to partner with you in manifesting that in the earth. And that approach is so empowering.
Yeah, it's good.
And it calls the greatness out of us.
Yeah.
Because it's like, most of us want to do well with our lives.
Right.
And the legalistic approach, it just communicates a lack of faith in someone that you want to do well. It just assumes that you want to ruin your life. And so it just
inherently evil. You're bad.
You're inherently
and so
evil.
you have to keep yourself in line and in check because you're inherently evil and bad. And so
Exactly.
Man, this was really good. I think we can think of American freedom at that aspect. A soldier that would lay down his life for his own country, right? They gave up his freedom so that we could have ours. There's so many different ways that you can apply this into your walk with God. Are you willing to exercise your freedom for someone else and sacrifice your freedom?
Yeah, that's
times,
such a great point.
so that someone else might be saved, so that someone else might have their chance to experience God, and they may experience God through your giving up of your freedom.
Yeah.
Right.
That's beautiful.
So
we're actually going to dive into that in future parts of this series, is that freedom is the tension, not just between legalism and licentiousness, which is just lacking restraint, but it's also the tension between resisting being made a slave by someone and willingly making yourself a servant of others, willingly laying down your life. Freedom is the tension between those two things. Every day, you walk in that tension to where you resist being imposed upon. Yeah. But also out of love for someone else, you allow yourself to become their servant in this. And it's just this. So that's why there can't be a set of rules, because every situation has different dynamics, different people involved, different things. Instead, we are given this freedom to walk in love and decide, in this moment, should I resist being imposed upon, or should I sacrifice myself for someone else?
Right.
And if God gave us clear rules for everything, we would just fall back into legalism.
Right.
Whereas what he does is says, I've given you freedom and I've given you my spirit and also your identity and destiny. And I believe in you to make the right decision in those circumstances. And so it pulls nobility and greatness out of you. So freedom is a high call with high expectations. Actually, the expectations are higher than those that legalism would ever enforce on you. But what freedom does is it fosters this life and prosperity and this sense of flourishing for everyone involved. You know what I mean? Rather than snuffing out people's lights and taking that life-giving energy from you.
I think there's so much more power in when you make a decision to do the right thing, that feeling you get is what God wants you to feel. I think it's a gift from God giving you free will to do the right thing, because that emotion, that energy, and that warm comfort of God just wrapping himself around you and saying, good job. I'm so glad you feel that when you make the decision to do the right thing and to potentially exercise your freedom for somebody else. And I think it diminishes that opportunity and the whole foundation of why you're doing what you're doing. If you're just doing it for a rule, if you're doing it for a rule, someone might ask you, why'd you do that? And it's like, because they told me to. But instead, it gives an opportunity for someone to say, why did you do that? And it's like, because it was the right thing to do. It was because I walk with God, and
I love that.
It's something he would do. Right. I would love that person. And it allows the Spirit of God. It allows the Spirit of God to be moved through you to someone else rather than just the law to be spoken. And I think the Spirit of God wants to interact amongst everyone. And so when you are exercising your freedom, you're allowing the Spirit of God to flow through you and to someone rather than just saying, it's because they told me to do that. Or,
lifeless.
It's lifeless. It's not the Spirit of God. It's the law. It becomes a law and a rule rather than allowing the Spirit of God to move through you.
Yeah. The law kills, the Spirit gives life. That's so good. So circling back to William Wilberforce now, when he started his fight for freedom in England, the American Revolution had already successfully happened, but the craziness in France was just ramping up. And the noble cause of freedom in Britain was kind of conflated with the butchery that was going on in France, particularly among the British monarchs, where the law could actually be changed. But because the British aristocracy, the houses of parliament, were watching the aristocrats and the monarchs of the French being beheaded, they were just envisioning the British abolitionists and the slaves who were finally free going after them and their families and burning down their houses and killing them. So the way the French behaved during their revolution actually pushed William Wilberforce's cause for freedom in Britain back by a decade. He had to overcome the stigma of the Reign of Terror, and it took a decade to get beyond that in order for freedom to actually be accomplished in Britain. So I just don't want us to make that mistake again when we talk about the freeborn and being free as Christians. I know why it makes parents nervous and pastors nervous, because in the past, when there's been a declaration of freedom, all of a sudden you have young people strung out on drugs and alcohol, in debt, illegitimate children. And it's just like they want to protect us from that in a lot of ways. So this idea of freedom has been conflated for us in the church world with out of control behavior that just turns into its own form of slavery again.
Yeah, it's associated with revolution and not reformation.
Exactly. To where legalism becomes the safe, wise decision that's not what we want for you.
Better be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so could the freeborn be among those
absolutely
who demonstrate what true freedom looks like, to the point where people look at it and they're just like, I want that. Like, I want to sail across the ocean and belong to that. You know what I mean?
For sure.
No one was sailing across the ocean to go to France, right?
No, for sure. Yeah.
But there's such prosperity, there's such joy, there's such life in their way of life that's connected to something that has to do with being free in Christ. I want that. you know? So that's the tone I want to set for this series on freedom is how you do freedom is just as important as freedom itself, how
Yeah.
you display it. And I want us to understand what it is, but also how you live it out, how you display it to skeptical people, how you display it to the world is super duper important.
No, that's good. Well, cool. Great story, great podcast. And I think we can all take something from it. So we want to thank you guys for listening. Again, continue to reach out. I will tell you, I cannot tell you enough, or even myself, the energy we put into these podcasts and the time that we take to do them. And then we get to hear back from you guys and we hear feedback and we hear positive stories. We hear testimonies and we want to continue to hear that. So we want to motivate you to share this podcast so someone in your life might need to hear it. And we want to motivate you to reach out and just show us some love just simply because it helps us. So we would love to hear from you. And if you need to talk through anything or discuss anything or would like us to touch on a topic in a little bit more detail, we're happy to do so. So feel free to reach out to us on social media or you can email us at thefreeborn8@gmail.com. And we will see you guys next week.